Before starting today's video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video to encourage us to provide the best. When I was around 6 or 7 years old, I accompanied my mother on some errands. We stopped at our church, which also functioned as a community center during the week. The plan was for us to be there for only 5 to 10 minutes, but I was already tired. As soon as my mother went inside, she left me in the car in the parking lot. Shortly after, a car pulled into the parking lot and parked very close to mine, despite the lot being nearly empty. A man got out, and instead of going into the church, he walked straight towards my car and looked right at me through the window. I was a very shy child and had been warned about stranger danger by my parents, my church, and McGruff the crime dog, so just seeing him walking my way made me nervous. When the man cupped his hands around his eyes to peer into the car at me, I became extremely frightened and quickly moved to the other side of the car. However, he continued to stare at me the entire time. I still remember that chilling look. I realized that it was not appropriate for an adult to display that level of interest in a child who was not related to them. He didn't even attempt to speak to me. He simply stared at me. At this point, one might argue that he was just a creepy person, but immediately after I moved to the other side of the car, he attempted to open the car door. Fortunately, my mother was cautious, and the car was locked and alarmed. As soon as he tugged on the door handle, the alarm went off, and I kicked into fight or flight mode. Without hesitation, I unlocked my side of the car, jumped out, and ran screaming into the church. I didn't look back to see if he was following me. I just ran as fast as I could. When I arrived, I ran into my Sunday school teacher and cried uncontrollably on her shoulder. Needless to say, the man in the car was gone by the time we went outside to investigate. A week later, the church installed cameras in the parking lot. Reflecting on this incident over the years, I think it's possible that he saw us while we were running errands and followed us to the church. I don't recall any police follow-up, but this occurred before 911, so my mother may have decided to let it go since the man didn't come close to succeeding due to the locked car door. I'm just relieved that he didn't accomplish whatever he had planned for me. As a child, I grew up in a religious household and was quite sheltered. My parents were the only adults I could really confide in, and making friends was a challenge since other kids tended to avoid the one who reminded them of their parents. Going to church and attending a private Christian school were pretty much the only social outlets available to me. I was at church almost every Sunday and on Wednesday nights for youth group without fail. Looking back, my 15-year-old self would probably be shocked at how much I've changed since then. One Wednesday night, my youth group let out early, and rather than sitting through the extended adult service, I decided to walk around the building and wait for my ride home. That's when I saw a man named Kevin sitting at the concierge desk, surrounded by papers and what appeared to be luggage. It was unusual to see someone there at 7:45 on a Wednesday night, and I found myself striking up a conversation with him. We talked about my school, my career aspirations, and my level of devotion to Christianity. Kevin claimed to be the host of an AM radio show where he discussed the Bible and various Christian topics. At first, I didn't think much of it, but there was a nagging feeling in the back of my mind that something wasn't quite right. As we delved into theology, Kevin started talking about what he believed to be a woman's role in a Christian household, insisting that even unmarried Christian women should adhere to certain standards. That's when things started to get weird. I can only speculate as to why he brought up the topic, but somehow we ended up discussing familiar spirits. That's when the conversation took a sharp turn. Kevin told me that a white dog always appears at his family's annual reunion, which takes place at the house of a deceased relative. According to him, the dog is a familiar spirit that attached itself to the deceased family member who once owned a white dog and claimed she would come back as one. Kevin believed the spirit took the form of the white dog to make the family think it was the deceased family member's presence. He and his family always looked forward to it. As the conversation dragged on, I realized that the other youth group attendees had made their way around to our area. Rita, one of the girls in the group, joined the conversation. That's when things got even weirder. Kevin pulled out a pink magazine targeted to Christian teen girls and went through several pages and stories, asking Rita several questions. It was supremely weird that a man in his 40s had a magazine like that, let alone that he was showing it to a young girl. When Rita's mother suddenly appeared and expressed interest in the magazine, Kevin told her she could buy it from various Christian bookstores for $20. I took this as my cue to leave, but not before Kevin suddenly grabbed my hand, held it for far too long, and kissed it. I didn't know how to react, but it left me feeling disgusted and confused. At the time, I was committed to saving myself for my future husband and avoiding any form of intimacy. Even now, as I write about that odd night, I can still feel the spit he left on my hand. It's gross. Over the years, I've thought about Kevin and that experience sporadically. Prior to today, it had been almost 4 years since it surfaced in my mind. Everything about him screamed that he was unwell and a predator, yet there he was in the church, looking for potential victims to groom or attack. What a creep. This didn't happen to me, but rather to a friend's mother when my friend was around 8 or 9 years old. At my friend's church, there were typically a lot of people, mainly middle-class Americans, but there were also homeless individuals who attended to worship and participate in church activities. One of these individuals was an old homeless man who would sit about 3 rows behind my friend, her mother, and her father during church services. One day, while they were at church, my friend became bored and started to look around. As she turned to glance behind her, she saw the old homeless man staring at her mother. He then looked at my friend and gave her an incredibly creepy smile. My friend became frightened and turned back around, but she couldn't help turning back repeatedly to check if the man was still staring at them. When the church service ended, my friend insisted that they leave immediately. Her mother and father were confused and asked why, so my friend told them about the creepy man who had been staring at them. However, her parents didn't think much of it and assumed she was just making things up. The next day, when they returned to the church, they sat in the same pew they always did. As they were settling in, my friend's mother noticed a piece of paper on the seat. Thinking that someone had left it behind, she picked it up to give it to the pastor. However, as she opened it and began to read, her face turned pale, and she dropped the paper to the floor. After picking up the paper, my friend read the message addressed to her mother, which said, "Hello, Christina. You probably don't remember me, but I remember you." She turned around and saw the homeless man, who had been staring and smiling at them. This caused my friend and her mother to panic, and my friend pointed to the man. When her mother looked at him, he made a creepy wave, and they couldn't understand how he knew her name when they had never spoken before. Feeling frightened and uneasy, my friend and her mother didn't return to that church for about 3 weeks. Instead, they started attending a different one. However, they began seeing the same homeless man walking around their neighborhood. They lived in a remote part of town with only houses and farms and no stores, so it didn't make sense for him to be there. My friend's mother became increasingly concerned and started forbidding her daughter from going outside alone. But being only 8 years old, my friend didn't listen and decided to ride her bike around the neighborhood. While doing so, she spotted the homeless man walking around and recognized him immediately. He saw her too and made a beeline straight towards her. She turned her bike around and pedaled as fast as she could to escape him. He started screaming, demanding to speak with her mother and calling out her name. She managed to make it back to her house and ran inside, where her mother was waiting and demanding to know where she had been. My friend was shaking and kept saying, "He's coming," while her mother saw the man approaching their house. She locked the door and called the police. The man tried to escape through some nearby woods, but the police caught him. It turns out he had sexually assaulted 3 women from the same church that my friend and her mother attended. He was arrested and is likely still in jail, but the whole ordeal remains incredibly unsettling. When I was around 11 years old, My family lived in Oakville, Texas. My father was the preacher at the local Baptist church situated just off I-37, and we resided in the parsonage behind it. Additionally, my father worked as a mechanic in the nearby town, which kept him away from home during the weekdays. However, he was a fantastic father, very funny, protective, kind, and generous. I had an older sister who mostly ignored me and didn't want to play, and there weren't many kids to play with in our small town. Consequently, I ended up playing alone with my Barbies, feeling very safe around the church grounds. Since our house lacked air conditioning, I usually played inside the church during the hottest parts of the summer days. I had access to the church key, which I got from the kitchen, and returned after unlocking the door. One midday Monday, while playing inside the church, I sensed that something was off. I was familiar with the church's smells and layout, since I played there frequently, and the hallway had a different musty scent. Walking around slowly, I felt like someone was watching me, which made me uneasy. I usually played in the auditorium and had set up my entire Barbie world with Charlie's Angels and Donny Osmond dolls all over the pews. I cleaned up after myself daily and put my toys in a satchel that I carried to and from home. That day, I continued to hear the building creak and the air conditioning turn on and off, but I felt increasingly uncomfortable and strange. Throughout the summer, I would often stand up and peer over the back pew, surveying the room. However, as I continued to play in the church, I started noticing that things were different, out of place, or not in the right spot. Since nobody went in or out of the church during the week, my family was responsible for the custodial work, including vacuuming and emptying the garbage cans. It was during this task that I began to find peculiar things like old t-shirts and magazines that were not appropriate for a church environment, let alone an 11-year-old. The most unsettling discovery was the words and poetry on paper, which were sad and dark, along with strange drawings. Each day, something seemed off, but it wasn't significant enough to prompt me to tell my mother or mention it to my father when he returned from work. One Saturday evening, my dad was home and asked me to fetch some paperwork from his office, which was adjacent to the auditorium. I stood by the back pew and could see clearly, even with the lights off, through the windows into the auditorium. I noticed a hazy smoke settling all around the front area near the podium. Although I had not been around cigarette smoke much up to that point in my life, I realized that the smell I had been detecting all summer was stale smoke. As I turned to enter the office, I realized that the door was open and felt a sense of dread. I immediately ran out of the church and into our house, where my dad was sitting, drinking coffee and looking at me. I recounted everything in one breath and began to cry. After my dad learned about the situation, he rushed over to the church with a shotgun to investigate. He discovered that a homeless man had been living in a utility closet there all summer, the same time I had been playing there every day. The man had entered through a window in a Sunday school room. My dad later told me that the man had a history of petty theft and breaking and entering, but he was actually a 27-year-old who needed a home and family. My dad helped him get a job and a place to stay at a local ranch, and he even attended church with us the following year. The man apologized to me personally for scaring me, and I could see the pain in his eyes. I hoped he would be okay. When I asked my dad about him later, he told me that the man eventually got married and had a baby girl. The lesson learned that summer was to trust your instincts when things seem off and to help others when possible. My dad's kindness changed the man's life for the better, and that is a valuable lesson to live by. Thank you for watching today's video. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking and sharing it to support me. The best is yet to come.